to do with their importance. I think you'll be familiar with the general theme of the minor prophets because we've already been through Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and in those books you saw the predictions and in some cases the fulfillment of what God said was going to befall the people because of their unfaithfulness toward him. Well, Hosea, I don't know if any of you tried to find a commentary or more information on Hosea, but Hosea and the story of Hosea, how that God asked him to marry a prostitute or a woman who was at least not faithful to him. And as you go through commentaries on this, depending on how old the commentary is, you'll find many of the commentators saying, well, this has got to be an allegory because God would never ask a man to do anything so disgusting. Well, I think those who hold that point of view are overlooking how God feels about sin. What's God's attitude toward what the Israelites were doing? And we'll see him describing that as we look at some of the verses in the book of Hosea. Obviously, we're not going to look at it verse by verse because there are just simply too many verses for 41 minutes and 39 seconds. But however that is, Hosea prophesied approximately from 755 down to 710 BC. And he was contemporary with Amos. Amos we'll come to Amos shortly in a couple of weeks. But he was contemporary with Amos for 2 years. Amos lived in Israel at Tekoa. He was also contemporary for 45 years, the entire lifetime of prophecy of the prophet Hosea. The entire time Isaiah was alive, but he was living in Jerusalem. Also, he overlapped Micah for 30 years. So these men, Micah was at Moresheth in Judah, but we see all of these men, whether they're in the north as Hosea was, or whether they're in the south as Isaiah and Micah were, they are all predicting the downfall of Judah and the downfall of Israel. Now, during the lifetime of Hosea, there were 3 kings in the nation of Judah. And he mentions those 3 kings here in the beginning of the first chapter, that he was prophesying during the reign of Uzziah, during the reign of Ahaz, during the reign of Ezekiel. And you might wonder, if he was up north, why is he mentioning the kings of the south? Well, I think it's because the kings in the south, or the nation in the south, continued for another 116 years. You see, the nation in the north fell in 722 BC, but it was around 606 when Nebuchadnezzar finally marched into Judea and took over there. But anyway, we'll not say much about Nebuchadnezzar because he's another story. But what we are looking at, the kings in Israel, in the northern kingdom, things were not going nearly as well up there as they were down in Judah. In Judah, there were only those 3 kings, and possibly during the reign of Uzziah, his son Jotham may have functioned as a co-regent because Uzziah became a leper and was not able to fulfill all of his functions as king. But in any case, during this period of time where there were 3 or 4, depending on how you count, kings in the south, there were, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 kings up north. And things were not going well at all up there. When Hosea started prophesying, Jeroboam II was the king in the north, and he died 2 years after Hosea began his prophecies. He was followed by Zechariah. You probably noticed King Zechariah in the north. He lived 6 months as king and was assassinated by Shallum. Shallum then, in turn, lasted 1 month, and he was assassinated by a man named Menachem. You remember a few years ago there was a Menachem Begin was the leader in Israel. Well, the name is still being used, and we may find that if we pronounce them right, we may find that is often the case, that these names that we see in the Bible with a modern pronunciation are still in use, like Moshe Dayan. He was their general for a while, and Moshe is simply the Hebrew pronunciation of Moses. So anyway, those are all beside the point. But all of those kings reigned in the north just briefly until we came down to a king named Hosea. Now, Hosea and Hosea, it's hard to keep them apart because they sound so much alike. But Hosea was a king at the time of the downfall of Israel, and he reigned for about 10 years, but he sought an alliance with Egypt. And if you remember the history of both of these nations, whether it's Judah or whether it's up north, that every time they relied on Egypt, they got in trouble. Egypt was not a reliable helper. In fact, well, I'm going to get on a sidetrack here, so I better stick to my notes. That's what you make notes for, so that you don't get sidetracked. But anyway, Hosea was still on the throne, or he was still prophesying when the nation fell to the Assyrians. And so for 12 years after the fall of the nation, he still continued to prophesy. And that may be why he lists the kings of Judah in order to set a timeline, rather than simply sticking with the kings of Israel. Because for that additional time, Israel, for all intents and purposes, had ceased to exist. Well, let me back up a little bit. We'll get a historical setting here. We're talking about the time period from 755 down to 710 BC. And at the beginning of this time period, Israel, the nation, the northern nation, was prosperous. They were doing well. The kingdom was even expanding under the first couple of kings that they had up there. They ruled well, but the problem was that there was moral and ethical corruption. It was general in both the north and the south, but right now we're only concerned with the north. But that was a general problem. And not only that, but the spiritual adultery, which God saw as adultery. And I believe that's why he called Hosea to enter into the marriage that he did, because God was disgusted. He was well, he couldn't stand it, what the nation of Israel was doing, the attitude they had. And remember back at the beginning when the nations divided, that Jeroboam the first had I don't know if you call it built or cast, I guess would be the word. He had cast a couple of golden calves, and he placed one way up north in Dan and the other one down south in Beersheba. And he said, it's too much for you people to go all the way to Jerusalem to worship, so you can do it here. Which was, of course, in violation of what God had instructed from the very beginning. He told them they should have no graven image, even if they made that image and said, this is the God of heaven. It was still a violation of his law. So anyway, we see the spiritual adultery of the kingdom of Israel, but this parallels what we see in the life of Hosea with his adulterous wife. So Jeroboam the first had put these calves there for the people to center their worship on. And remember, even down in the time of Christ, the woman at the well, what it was she said to Christ, you say we should worship in Jerusalem, but we say here in Mount Gerizim. And of course, Jesus corrected that. But the point is that this influence existed all the way down through that time period, even though when the Assyrian king came in and defeated the nation of Israel, came in and took over, he scattered the people. He took them and he deported them to various other parts of his realm, and he brought in people from other places and settled them in the north. And of course, this is what was the foundation, I guess we'd call it, of the difference between the Samaritans and the Jews. In the time of Christ, we see that the Jews looked down on the Samaritans. They were not really worth anything in the eyes of the Jews. And so there was a constant conflict there among individuals. A person who was a Jew would, well, we saw cases where they actually went across the river and went up on the east side and then came back across to get to the other part of Judea in the time of Christ. We see them doing that in order to avoid going through Samaria. All right. So anyway, that history that we see being played out in the New Testament goes all the way back to this time. This time when, Sargon, the king of the Assyrians, defeated Samaria. All right. What were the people doing also in addition to their worship of the golden calves or worship before the golden calves? They were worshiping the Baals. And the word Baal or Baal simply means Lord. And so usually when you see it in the Old Testament, it'll have a name attached to it. Like Baal Peor, that's the Lord of Peor, because they looked upon their deities, the pagans at least, looked upon their deities as local. This is our God, and he's powerful right here, but if we go way over there, we're going to have to find out who's the God over there. This was the attitude that they had, and unfortunately, since the people in the north adopted some of their deities, they also adopted some of these attitudes. So remember earlier that Elijah had cleansed the kingdom of Baal worship. The 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Ashtoreth, he had executed them all after showing that God would send down fire from heaven to consume a sacrifice, but their God couldn't do it, or their pretended God. So anyway, not too many years earlier, Elijah had cleansed the kingdom of this Baal worship. And yet here it is again in the time of Hosea. By 755, when Hosea began his prophesying, the worship of Baal was back. And along with him, a number of others. So, remember, right at the beginning of the book of Hosea, when Hosea's first, or at least Gomer's first child was born, let's just read from verse 3. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to them, call his name Jezreel, for in a little while I will avenge the bloodshed of Jezreel on the house of Jehu, and bring to an end the kingdom of the house of Israel. So this is early on in the book. We see a prediction of the end of the house of Israel, the end of the nation of Israel. But specifically there, he's thinking of the things that Jehu did. And if you want to read about that, go back to 2 Kings, chapters 9 and 10. We're not going to do that tonight in order to save a little bit of time. But if you go back and look at that, Jehu he is praised by God in 2 Kings for doing what God told him to do, which was to wipe out the family of Ahab and Jezebel. And he did that. But the problem was, when that was done, he kept going. This business of killing everybody that might be a problem for him, or everybody that might be a threat to him, he couldn't get enough of it. It just kept on doing that. And so when we look here in Hosea, the book of Hosea, we see that God eventually was not happy with what Jehu did. He originally praised him for doing what God had told him to do, but he didn't praise him for going on beyond that. Also, if we go back to 2 Kings chapter 10, I believe it is, there we'll see that all of the things that Jeroboam the first, who caused Israel to sin, all the things that he had been doing, that Jehu continued them. He didn't correct anything. He just killed off the family of Ahab and the family of Jezebel, all the relatives. All right, so Jehu's character comes out to some extent if you go back and read about him in the book of Kings, when he was approaching the man he was to assassinate. He asked someone to look out and see who was coming. And the one who looked out said, he drives furiously like Jehu. So we get a little glimpse of Jehu's character there. We also see that he continued all the sins that had been going on before, and his zeal was really for himself, not for God. So here we find God saying that he is going to avenge the blood of Jezreel on the household of Jehu. So that's why that appears, I believe. And if you read a commentary they will say, oh, here's an obvious conflict between what it says in the book of 2 Kings and what Hosea is prophesying. Well, it depends, whether you want to see the truth or whether you want to make it look different. All right. We find that not only did Israel fall to the Baals and to the golden calves that Jeroboam had cast, but they also respected Molech and Dagon and Chemosh, who were other gods of the peoples around them. And all of this God sees as a spiritual adultery, as a violation and a disrespect toward him. So even though, back in 2 Kings chapter 10 and verse 32, we find the statement, in those days the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. And Hazael, king of Syria, conquered them in all the territory of Israel. So, even at the time that Jehu died, God began to reduce the northern kingdom in size, so that by the time the Assyrians finally came in to put an end to the northern kingdom, it mainly consisted of the city of Samaria and a little bit of territory around it. You see, it had just been whittled away until there was not much left. All right. So while Israel was declining and while things were not going well in Israel, up in Assyria things were going very well. And Assyria was becoming greater and greater. Every enemy that they came up against, they defeated. So in 743, Tiglath-Pileser III, he made Israel a subject to Assyria. And from that time forward, or most of the time until they actually destroyed Israel, Israel paid tribute to the king of Assyria. Every year, if you go back and read in 2 Kings, you'll be able to find out exactly how much they wanted, how much they collected every year. And that lasted at that level down till about 725. And then there was a 3-year period in which the Assyrians besieged Samaria under Shalmaneser V. And during that time, it was a severe problem in the city of Samaria. You can also read about that. But finally, in 722, Shalmaneser died, and his son Sargon II, you won't need to remember all these names, but I don't know how to tell the story without saying them. The son is the one, the Sargon, he's the one who completely destroyed the nation of Israel. And he's the one who deported people. You read in the Old Testament about leading people away with a hook in their nose. Pretty gruesome. So what happened in the north was that a good portion of the population was replaced by a population from somewhere else. It's as if someone, say China, were to defeat America and began moving all the people in West Virginia to Puerto Rico and moving all the Puerto Ricans here, then soon we'd have a situation where it's impossible to rebel against the Assyrians because you don't have enough of your companions, enough people who speak your language close to you to get together a rebellion. And this was the way the Assyrians always handled their victories: to move one population, scatter it out, and to move something else in, so that they retained control. Well, all of this is going on. This is the historical setting for what we're going to see in the book of Hosea. And Hosea's message could basically be boiled down to three things. God hates sin. He finds it disgusting, deplorable. He can't stand it. Judgment is coming. And finally, God's love and mercy remain at the end. So as we go through this book, or the parts of it that we go through, we're not going to have time to go through every verse in the book. But Israel's history basically parallels what we see in the life of Hosea. Basically, we have a parallel there. The first child that's born to Gomer, the wife of Hosea, and this is the only one where it seems that Hosea knew for sure that he was the father. It says in verse 3 there, "So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son." So the indication there is that he understood this to be his child. But as time goes along, in verse 6, "And she conceived again and bore a daughter. Then God said to him, 'Call her name Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. Yet I will have mercy on the house of Judah, will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, nor by sword or battle, by horses or horsemen.'" So God is still taking care of Judah. Judah's problems are not as severe as those in the north, where God has been pretty much completely deserted. All right, so we're going to see some sources of conflict. There's one more child that's born. In verse 8 of the first chapter, it says, "Now when she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, she conceived and bore a son. Then God said, 'Call his name Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I will not be your God.'" It reminds me of what we read concerning Judah, when the point came that God found things in Judah so disgusting that it says he departed from the temple. He was no longer there in the midst of the people like he had wanted to be. And so anyway, in the second chapter, we begin to see some of the things that are going on that help us to understand the conflict between the people and God. I'm going to just paraphrase some of this in order to get us up to chapter 2 and verse 12 and 13 there, which we want to look at. But Gomer is crediting her lovers for the blessings that she enjoys, but Hosea is actually the one who is providing for her. He's actually the one who's giving her all these things that she thinks are coming from her lovers. So in verses 12 and 13 of the second chapter, it says, "And I will destroy her vines and her fig trees, of which she has said, 'These are my wages that my lovers have given me.' So I will make them a forest, and the beasts of the field shall eat them. I will punish her for the days of the Baals to which she has burned incense. She decked herself with her earrings and jewelry and went after her lovers, but me she forgot, says the Lord. So we see in each case here, the comparison is between Gomer and Israel. That what Gomer does is parallel to what Israel as a nation is doing. And he says here that she's giving Baal credit for, she's burning incense to him. She's looking to the false gods. This is a picture of what Israel was doing. But how is Gomer thinking? Well, she's thinking, in verse 12 there, she says, "These are my wages that my lovers have given me." You see, instead of giving Hosea the credit for what she had, she was giving her lovers the credit. Just as the people were giving the false gods credit for their blessings and ignoring the God of heaven. Well, it goes on. Like I said, we're not going to be able to cover this verse by any means, but turn over to chapter 4 and verses 17 and 18 there. Well, a little further here. It says, and in a couple of cases here, Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim is held up as the symbol for the entire nation of Israel. But he says, Ephraim is joined to idols. Let him alone. Their drink is rebellion. They commit harlotry continually. Her rulers dearly love dishonor. The wind has wrapped her up in its wings, and they shall be ashamed because of their sacrifices. So the people are, they're identifying, well, joining themselves to the idols rather than to God, and giving God credit for their blessings. But in the midst of all that, there's the moral corruption that is pervasive in the nation. Back up a little bit to verse 14 there. He said, I will not punish your daughters when they commit harlotry, nor your brides when they commit adultery. For the men themselves go apart with harlots and offer sacrifices with a ritual harlot. Therefore, people who do not understand will be trampled. So these people they're going to face a judgment. They're going to face retribution for this moral corruption that is pervasive in the nation, and for joining to idols. And many times the service to these idols involved immorality. Another place that we might note some of this problem that exists in chapter 7 and verse 8, beginning. It says, Ephraim has mixed himself among the people. Ephraim is a cake unturned. What does it mean to be mixed among the people? Well, he's lost his identity. He's no longer identified as part of the people of God. No longer can they say, well, actually, we're God's people. We got our golden calves up here in Dan and down in Beersheba, and we worship there. We're worshiping the God of heaven. We just have the idols which God had forbidden. All right, so Ephraim's identity is lost. Israel's identity is lost, just like Gomer's identity had been lost as the wife of Hosea. She has gone to the point where Hosea can no longer say, well, there's my wife. She can no longer say, Hosea is my husband, because there's so much immorality involved there that they're no longer identified together. This was a people which was supposed to be holy. We understand the meaning of the word holy, something that's set aside for a specific purpose. I always think when I hear that, every Thursday, my mother used to bake bread, and there was always a little bit that she saved back of the dough, put it aside, and when the bread was all baked, she made cinnamon rolls. So that was a big thing for us kids every Thursday while we lived on the farm. But anyway, that was set aside. That was, in a sense, it was holy because it was set aside for a specific purpose. You and I today, we're supposed to be set aside for God's specific purpose as Christians. So when we look at the book of Hosea, we can't say, well, that was back then. It doesn't really mean anything to us. It does mean something to us because we are supposed to be God's, what was that Bob said on Sunday, God's peculiar people. Sometimes we're a little bit peculiar, but we're people of his own possession. If you look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9 there, where it talks about how God sees his people, a holy nation, a people of God's own possession. That's what we're supposed to be, and that's what Israel was supposed to be back there 700 years before Christ. Okay, not only does he say that Ephraim has lost his identity and that he's mixed among the people, he's just like all the rest of them. But not only that, it says he's like a cake unturned. Did you ever try to eat a pancake that's only cooked on one side? It's kind of messy. Well, that's the picture we see here. These people, they're done on one side, but not on the other side. And they're not even aware of their condition. It's never dawned on them what their actual condition is. And we see a half-heartedness, even though they may have had the two golden calves to call symbols of God. It's still a half-hearted thing. And it reminds me of what Jesus, or what the book of Revelation says about the church at Laodicea, that they're lukewarm, and therefore they're disgusting. Well, likewise, a half-cooked pancake is disgusting. You wouldn't want to try to eat it. This people, the Israelites, they've become unpalatable to God, leaving a bad taste for him. Verse 9 there says, aliens have devoured his strength, but he does not know it. Yes, gray hairs are here and there on him, yet he does not know it. Think about the situation of Gomer. She thinks she's so well off. She's got all these things that she thinks her lovers have given her. She thinks, well, I've given them favors and now they're giving me favors. Things are going great for me. And she had no idea what all of this was costing her, how this was destroying her life. The picture we see here of Ephraim, aliens have devoured his strength. Gomer was becoming used up, old, worn out, and she didn't realize it. And it's not a nice thing to talk about, but what happens to old prostitutes? Well, they become undesirable and they're deserted. What was happening to Gomer? Well, we're going to find out pretty soon that those that supposedly were all her lovers and valued her so much, now they've sold her into slavery. It says that Ephraim has gray hair here and there, premature aging. They're unaware of the deterioration that's taking place in the nation. But God's aware of it. God knows what's happening. This is paralleled by what's happening in the life of Gomer. Go over to chapter 8. We'll look at a verse there. Chapter 8 and verse 8. It says, Israel is swallowed up. Now they're among the Gentiles, like a vessel in which is no pleasure. For Hosea, what's left? Worry, disappointment, feeling deserted and like nobody cares about him. What's God's attitude? I worry about these people. I've tried to bless them in every way, and yet I'm disappointed. Yet there's no reciprocation. I love them, but they don't love me anymore. So if we were to go back and look at all of these places where God's position toward Israel is compared, we'd also find in the same chapters that God, in every case, is calling them to come back, offering them a way back, and yet they're not interested. Here, Israel is described as a vessel in which there's no joy, in which there's no pleasure. Sometimes if you go to an antique shop, you'll find some very expensive old pots, old pottery. Somebody made it 200 years ago, and because of that, collectors want it, and they give it a value. But what if it's broken? The collector doesn't want it anymore. It's lost its value. Gomer had lost her value. And Israel had lost its value as a national entity. Its identity's gone. God says, when that third child was born, they're not my people, lo ami, not my people. You're just like all the pagan nations. You're supposed to be the holy nation belonging to me. And what are you doing? You've mixed yourself with all of these pagan things. One more, I know my time's up, but one more place. Let's look over in chapter 12 and verse 7. It says, a cunning Canaanite, deceitful scales are in his hand. He loves to oppress, and Ephraim says, surely I have become rich. I have found wealth for myself. In all my labors, they shall find in me no iniquity that is sin. Remember, this is a people, they're far from God, and yet they don't realize where they are. They don't realize how bad things are. Well, Israel refused to believe the prophets, men like Hosea and Micah and others who prophesied. They foretold what was going to happen. And they didn't realize until judgment came. They didn't realize until punishment came what their real condition was. But you know, my time is up for the class, but when I look at Hosea, and I think about in the New Testament where it talks about the Old Testament as being a shadow of what's to come, you know, God still hates sin. It's still an abomination in his sight. It's still disgusting to him. And it can stand between us and him. Like Isaiah chapter 59, verse 2 there says that God's hand is not shortened, that he can't, or he's not unable to hear us. But our sins have separated us from God. This is man's state without forgiveness. Just like in the Old Testament there, it talked about a judgment that was coming, that was certain. There's no avoiding it because it has been prophesied, it has been established by God that if these people are not faithful, it's all spelled out. You can go back to the Old Testament. A good place to go is 2 Kings chapter 17, where God lays down all of his feelings about what's going on in Israel. Well, what about us? If God were to write a book, as he did with the Old Testament, what would he be saying about us? There's a judgment coming. There's an ultimate separation that can occur if we reject God. But look at chapter 14 of Hosea. And there, I don't have time to read it now, but I was going to go through that. But what we see there is God's love and God's mercy saying, if these people come back, I'll love them, I'll bless them, I'll take care of them. What about you and me? If we come to him, will he not keep his promises? Will he not do what he said he would do? Will he not give us the forgiveness that we may need if we're not his? You have the opportunity this evening as we sing together to come to Christ, to be immersed in the waters of baptism, to have sins washed away, to start anew. Just like God loved those people, sinful people, and offered them a way of hope, so he offers us a way of hope. Won't you take advantage of it this evening?